The fluorescent lights of Murphy's bar cast a harsh glow over the crowded space, filled with the usual mix of off-duty military personnel, local college students, and weekend warriors looking to blow off steam. The bass from the jukebox thumped through the floorboards as glasses clinked, and voices rose in animated conversation. It was Friday night in Norfolk, Virginia, and the bar was packed to capacity with people seeking refuge from another week of military routine. At a corner table near the back, Admiral Sarah Chun sat quietly nursing a club soda with lime, her shoulder-length black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, and a navy blue sweater, deliberately choosing to blend in rather than stand out. At 42, she had learned the value of observing rather than commanding when she was off duty. Her dark eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the room with the practiced awareness of someone who had spent decades in dangerous situations. Sarah had come to Murphy's not for the atmosphere, but for the anonymity. As one of the Navy's youngest female admirals and the first woman to command a SEAL team in combat operations, her face was becoming increasingly recognizable. Tonight, she simply wanted to be another patron in a crowded bar, to listen to conversations that weren't about naval strategy or international security briefings. She had chosen this particular establishment because it was known to attract lower-ranking personnel who wouldn't immediately recognize her. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was hiding in plain sight among the very people she commanded, but sometimes even admirals needed a break from the weight of responsibility that came with their stars. The evening had been peaceful until a group of young recruits stumbled through the front door, their voices already elevated from pre-gaming somewhere else. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Fresh out of boot camp, full of themselves, and convinced that wearing the uniform made them invincible. She had seen thousands of young men and women just like them over her career, some who would grow into exceptional sailors, others who would wash out before completing their first tour. The leader of the group was particularly loud, a tall, lanky young man with close-cropped blonde hair and the kind of swagger that screamed inexperience. His name tape read Davidson, and from his boisterous storytelling, Sarah gathered he was fresh out of Navy boot camp and assigned to a support unit at the nearby base. He was regaling his friends with tales of his supposed prowess, each story more embellished than the last. "I'm telling you guys, I could have been a SEAL if I wanted," Davidson proclaimed, his voice carrying across the bar as he gestured wildly with his beer bottle. "But I didn't want to deal with all that underwater breathing stuff. Plus, I heard their commanding officers are all washed up has-beens anyway." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she remained silent, taking another sip of her drink. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times before. Young recruits often felt the need to diminish what they couldn't achieve, and Davidson was clearly compensating for something. Besides, Davidson continued, growing more animated as his audience laughed, "I bet half those SEAL commanders couldn't even handle a real fight. Probably all politics and paperwork now. I could take any of them in a fair fight." His friends egged him on, their own inexperience making Davidson's bragging seem plausible rather than pathetic. Sarah found herself studying the young man, noting the soft edges around his middle that suggested he hadn't maintained the fitness standards expected of active-duty personnel, the slight tremor in his hands that indicated this wasn't his first drink of the evening. The conversation might have continued without incident if Davidson hadn't decided he needed another beer. As he pushed back from his table, his coordination already compromised by alcohol, he stumbled slightly and bumped into a passing waitress. The young woman, carrying a tray full of drinks, stumbled forward to avoid dropping everything. "Watch where you're going," Davidson snapped, his voice sharp with irritation despite being clearly at fault. The waitress, a college-age girl with tired eyes who was clearly working to pay for school, apologized quickly and continued on her way. But Davidson wasn't finished. Emboldened by his audience and the alcohol in his system, he decided to make a scene. "Typical civilian," he announced loudly. "No respect for military personnel. Someone should teach her some manners." Sarah felt her hands tighten around her glass. She had spent her career fighting not just enemies of the United States, but also the casual disrespect and entitlement that some members of the military displayed toward civilians. It was exactly this kind of behavior that gave all service members a bad reputation. Davidson made his way toward the bar, weaving slightly as he walked. The path took him directly past Sarah's table, and As he approached, she could see the glossy look in his eyes that confirmed her suspicion about his level of intoxication. She hoped he would simply pass by, allowing her to finish her drink in peace and leave without incident. But as Davidson drew level with her table, he seemed to notice her for the first time. His eyes, unfocused but arrogant, swept over her dismissively. To him, she was just another civilian, probably some local woman out for drinks. The fact that she was sitting alone made her an easy target for his alcohol-fueled bravado. "Excuse me, lady," Davidson said, his tone condescending as he gestured vaguely in her direction. "You mind moving? Me and my boys need this table. Military personnel have priority." Sarah looked up at him calmly, her expression neutral, but her eyes alert. "I'm sorry, but I was here first. There are other tables available." Her voice was quiet, but carried an undertone of authority that Davidson, in his intoxicated state, completely missed. He interpreted her calm response as weakness, a civilian's inability to stand up to military authority. "Listen, sweetheart," Davidson said, his voice growing louder and attracting attention from nearby tables. "You obviously don't understand how things work around here. When military personnel need something, civilians step aside. It's called respect." The conversation around them began to die down as other patrons noticed the confrontation developing. Sarah remained seated, her posture relaxed but ready. She had faced down international terrorists and hostile foreign operatives. One drunk recruit was hardly a threat, but she was hoping to defuse the situation without revealing her identity. "I understand perfectly," Sarah replied evenly. "I also understand that off-duty military personnel are expected to conduct themselves with honor and respect for all citizens, not use their service as an excuse for poor behavior." Davidson's face flushed red, whether from alcohol or anger Sarah couldn't tell. His friends had noticed the confrontation and were making their way over, sensing drama and eager to support their leader's display of dominance. "Oh, so now you're going to lecture me about military conduct?" Davidson sneered. "What would some civilian know about honor and respect? You probably never serve a day in your life. Never put yourself in harm's way for your country." The irony of his statement was almost overwhelming. Sarah had spent the better part of 2 decades in harm's way, leading missions that Davidson couldn't even imagine. She had earned her stars through exceptional service in some of the most dangerous operational theaters in the world. But she remained silent, still hoping to avoid escalating the situation. "Look, I don't want any trouble," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm and reasonable. "Why don't we all just enjoy our evening and leave each other alone?" But Davidson was past the point of reason. The alcohol, the audience of his peers, and what he perceived as disrespect from a civilian had combined to create a volatile situation. He stepped closer to her table, his body language becoming more aggressive. "No, I think you need to learn some respect," Davidson said, his voice rising. "Maybe someone needs to teach you what happens when you disrespect American military personnel." The threat was clear, and Sarah felt the familiar calm that came over her in dangerous situations. Her training kicked in automatically, her body preparing for action while her mind calculated distances, angles, and potential responses. But she gave Davidson one more chance to back down. "I suggest you walk away," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a steel that cut through the ambient noise of the bar. "Before you do something you'll regret." Davidson either didn't hear the warning in her tone or chose to ignore it. Instead, he interpreted her measured response as fear. With his friends watching and his judgment clouded by alcohol, he made a decision that would change the course of his military career. "Or what?" Davidson challenged, stepping even closer. "What's some civilian going to do to stop me?" Without warning, he reached out and gave Sarah a hard shove, intending to knock her backward in her chair and assert his dominance. It was exactly the kind of move that had probably worked for him in high school, bullying smaller or weaker opponents into submission. But Sarah Chun was neither small nor weak. As Davidson's hands made contact with her shoulders, her body moved with fluid precision. Years of combat training, countless hours of hand-to-hand combat practice, and real-world experience facing life-or-death situations had honed her reflexes to a razor's edge. In one smooth motion, Sarah slipped sideways out of the chair, causing Davidson's momentum to carry him forward off balance. Before he could recover, she had captured his extended arm, applied a joint lock that sent lightning bolts of pain up to his shoulder, and guided him face first into the table he had been so eager to claim. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. Davidson found himself pinned against the wooden surface, his arm twisted behind his back in a position that made any movement excruciating. The bar fell silent except for the sound of Davidson's labored breathing and the distant jukebox continuing its cycle. "What the hell?" One of Davidson's friends started forward, but stopped short when Sarah's eyes locked onto his. There was something in her gaze that made it clear approaching would be a very bad idea. "I tried to give you a chance to walk away," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed bar. Davidson struggled briefly against her grip, but the joint lock was expertly applied, and any movement only increased his pain. "Let me go," Davidson gasped, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "You can't do this to military personnel." Sarah applied just enough additional pressure to get his complete attention. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice calm, but carrying absolute authority. "You assaulted me. You threatened me. And you did it while claiming to represent the United States military. You're a disgrace to the uniform." The crowd that had gathered around them was a mix of civilians and off-duty military personnel. Some of the older service members in the audience were beginning to recognize that this wasn't a typical bar fight. The woman's technique, her calm demeanor under pressure, and her obvious comfort with violence suggested training that went far beyond civilian self-defense classes. Davidson's friends stood frozen, unsure whether to help their leader or distance themselves from what was clearly a situation spiraling out of their control. The waitress Davidson had earlier berated watched from behind the bar, her expression showing a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "I'm going to let you up now," Sarah continued, maintaining the lock while she spoke. "And you're going to apologize to the waitress you mistreated earlier. Then you're going to leave this establishment quietly and think very carefully about whether the military is really the right career path for you." She released the hold and stepped back, giving Davidson space to recover his dignity if he chose to use it wisely. He straightened slowly, rubbing his shoulder and trying to process what had just happened. His face was red with embarrassment and anger, and Sarah could see him weighing his options. For a moment, it seemed like he might have learned his lesson, but pride and alcohol proved to be a dangerous combination. Instead of accepting the lesson and walking away, Davidson decided to double down on his mistake. "You think you're so tough?" he snarled, turning to face her. "That was just luck. I wasn't ready for some crazy woman to attack me." The silence in the bar was deafening. Even Davidson's friends were backing away now, sensing that their leader was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Sarah stood relaxed, but ready, her expression showing neither anger nor fear, just the calm professionalism of someone who had faced far worse threats than one drunk recruit. "Last chance," Sarah said simply. "Walk away." But Davidson was beyond reason now. Humiliated in front of his peers and unable to accept that a civilian woman had bested him, he decided to escalate to a level that would have consequences far beyond a simple bar fight. "I don't take orders from civilians," Davidson said loudly, making sure everyone in the bar could hear him. "And I sure as hell don't take them from some woman who thinks she's tough." He started to move toward her again, his fists clenched and his intention clear. But before he could take more than a step, a voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "Attention!" The command came from near the bar's entrance, delivered with such authority that every military person in the establishment, including Davidson, automatically straightened to attention. Turning toward the voice, they saw a grizzled Master Chief Petty Officer who had clearly been in the Navy longer than most of them had been alive. Master Chief Rodriguez was a legend in Norfolk, a man who had served on submarines, destroyers, and in special operations. His presence commanded instant respect from anyone who wore the uniform. But more importantly for the situation at hand, he was one of the few people in the bar who had immediately recognized Sarah the moment the confrontation began. "What in God's name is happening here?" Rodriguez demanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 3 decades of military service. His eyes swept the scene, taking in Davidson's disheveled appearance, Sarah's calm stance, and the crowd of onlookers. Davidson, still at attention despite his intoxication, struggled to find words. "Master Chief, this civilian attacked me." "I was just shut your mouth, recruit," Rodriguez snapped, his voice cutting Davidson off mid-sentence. "Not another word." The Master Chief walked slowly across the bar, his eyes never leaving Davidson's face. When he reached the center of the confrontation, he turned to address the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disturbance. The Navy does not condone this kind of behavior from its personnel, and I assure you this situation will be addressed through proper channels. Then, he turned to Sarah, his weathered face showing a mixture of respect and concern. Ma'am, are you injured? Do you require medical attention? Sarah shook her head slightly. I'm fine, Master Chief. No harm done. Rodriguez nodded, but his expression remained serious. With respect, ma'am, I think this situation has gone far enough. Perhaps it's time these young sailors learned exactly who they've been dealing with. Davidson looked confused, his alcohol-clouded mind struggling to understand the undercurrents in the conversation. But some of the other military personnel in the bar were beginning to piece things together. The Master Chief's deferential tone toward a civilian, the woman's obvious training and composure under pressure, and her age and bearing all suggested she wasn't just any civilian. Sarah considered the Master Chief's suggestion. She had hoped to avoid revealing her identity, to handle this situation quietly and without creating an incident that would require official reports and investigations. But Davidson's continued aggression and complete lack of respect had made that impossible. Very well, Sarah said quietly. She reached in her back pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet, opening it to reveal the identification that would change everything Davidson thought he knew about the evening's events. Recruit Davidson, she said, her voice now carrying the full weight of command authority. I am Admiral Sarah Chun, United States Navy. You have just assaulted a superior officer. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Davidson's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, and, finally, dawning horror as the implications of what he had done began to sink in. Around them, the bar erupted in whispers as word spread through the crowd. Davidson's friends had gone pale, suddenly, realizing that their evening of bragging and bravado had just become a career-ending nightmare. The older military personnel in the bar were already reaching for their phones, knowing that news of this incident would spread through the Norfolk naval community within hours. That's impossible, Davidson stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. You're just some woman in a bar. Sarah studied him with the same calm professionalism she brought to international crisis situations. That's exactly the problem with your thinking, recruit. You saw a woman sitting alone and assumed she was weak, vulnerable, and unworthy of respect. You used your uniform as an excuse to bully what you thought was a civilian. And when that civilian defended herself, you escalated to assault. Master Chief Rodriguez stepped forward, his face grim. Recruit Davidson, you are to remain at attention and not speak unless directly questioned. Do you understand? Yes, Master Chief. Davidson managed, his voice cracking. Sarah looked around the bar, noting the mixture of shock, awe, and curiosity on the faces surrounding them. This was exactly the kind of spectacle she had hoped to avoid, but Davidson's actions had made privacy impossible. Master Chief, Sarah said, I think it's time to take this conversation somewhere more appropriate. This young man and his friends have some serious questions to answer about their conduct this evening. Rodriguez nodded sharply. Absolutely, Admiral. I'll contact base security immediately. As the Master Chief pulled out his phone to make the call, Sarah turned back to Davidson. The young recruit was swaying slightly, the combined effects of alcohol and shock making it difficult for him to maintain his military bearing. Recruit, Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. You have just learned a very expensive lesson about making assumptions. Tonight, your actions have endangered not just your own military career, but potentially those of your friends as well. I hope you think it was worth it. Davidson opened his mouth as if to speak, but Master Chief Rodriguez's sharp glare silenced him immediately. The base security team will be here in 10 minutes, Rodriguez announced. Admiral, would you prefer to handle this through official channels, or? Sarah considered her options. Officially reporting the incident would mean paperwork, investigations, and publicity that neither she nor the Navy needed. But letting it slide would send the wrong message about accountability and the consequences of misconduct. We'll handle this officially, Sarah decided. Recruit Davidson needs to understand that actions have consequences, especially for those who wear the uniform. The next few minutes passed in tense silence as they waited for base security to arrive. Davidson remained at attention, his face growing progressively paler as the reality of his situation sank in. His friends clustered nearby, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. When the military police arrived, led by a senior petty officer who immediately recognized Admiral Chun, the transfer of custody was swift and professional. Davidson and his companions were escorted from the bar with minimal fuss, though the entire establishment watched the proceedings with intense interest. As the last of the military police disappeared through the door, the normal sounds of the bar slowly resumed. But Sarah knew that her peaceful evening was over. She had become the center of attention, and there was no going back to anonymity. Master Chief Rodriguez approached her table as she gathered her things. "Admiral, I want to apologize for that recruit's behavior. It was inexcusable, and it doesn't represent the values we try to instill in our sailors." Sarah nodded, understanding the Master Chief's position. "I know, Rodriguez. Unfortunately, Davidson's attitude isn't as uncommon as we'd like to think. This is exactly why we need to continue working on military culture and respect for all people." "Yes, ma'am. Is there anything else you need tonight?" Sarah shook her head. "No, I think I've had enough excitement for one evening. But, Rodriguez, make sure this incident is handled properly. That young man needs to understand that the uniform doesn't give him the right to mistreat anyone, civilian or military." "Understood, Admiral. It will be handled appropriately." As Sarah left Murphy's bar and walked into the cool Norfolk evening, she reflected on the events that had just unfolded. What had started as a simple desire for a quiet drink had turned into a lesson in assumptions, respect, and the responsibilities that came with military service. Tomorrow, she would have to deal with the official reports, the investigation, and probably some uncomfortable questions from her superiors about why she had been in an enlisted personnel bar in the first place. But tonight, she was satisfied that an important lesson had been taught, even if the student might not fully appreciate it yet. Behind her, Murphy's bar was already returning to normal, though she knew the story of the night's events would be told and retold for years to come. It would become part of Navy folklore, a cautionary tale about the importance of respect and the dangers of underestimating people based on appearances. As she walked toward her car, Sarah couldn't help but smile slightly. Sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected places, and sometimes those lessons needed to be taught with more than just words. The night air was crisp and clean, a sharp contrast to the stuffy atmosphere of the bar. Sarah took a deep breath and let the tension of the evening begin to fade. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities to serve her country. But tonight, she had reminded one young recruit that service meant more than just wearing the uniform. It meant earning the right to wear it with honor. The harsh fluorescent lights of Naval Station Norfolk's detention facility cast everything in an unforgiving white glare. Recruit Davidson sat on a metal bench in the holding area, his hands cuffed behind his back, staring at the institutional green walls that seemed to close in around him with each passing hour. The alcohol had long since worn off, leaving him with a pounding headache and the crystal-clear memory of what had transpired at Murphy's bar. Across from him, his three friends, recruits Martinez, Thompson, and Williams, sat in similar states of shock and disbelief. None of them had been charged yet, but they were being held as witnesses and potential accomplices to what the military police had described as assault on a superior officer and conduct unbecoming. Davidson's mind raced as he tried to process what had happened. The woman he had pushed, the person he had dismissed as just another civilian, was Admiral Sarah Chun. He had heard her name before, everyone in the Navy had. She was a legend, one of the most decorated officers in modern naval history, the first woman to command SEAL operations in combat. And he had put his hands on her in a bar fight. The thought made him physically sick. "This can't be happening," Martinez whispered, his voice barely audible in the sterile room. "Tell me this is some kind of nightmare." Thompson, normally the quietest of the group, looked like he was about to cry. "My dad's going to kill me. He's a chief petty officer. This is going to destroy his reputation too." Williams just stared at the floor, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. Davidson said nothing. What was there to say? He had been the one talking big about SEALs and their commanders. He had been the one to escalate the situation. He had been the one to put his hands on Admiral Chun. His friends were here because they had been with him, but he was the one who had committed what could potentially be career-ending offenses. The door to the holding area opened with a metallic clang, and Master Chief Rodriguez entered, followed by Lieutenant Commander Sarah Walsh, the base's legal officer. Both wore expressions of professional seriousness that made Davidson's stomach sink even further. "Gentlemen," Lieutenant Commander Walsh began, her voice crisp and official. You are here because of an incident involving Admiral Sarachon at an off-base establishment. Before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand the gravity of this situation. She opened a folder and began reading from an official report. Recruit Davidson, you are being investigated for assault on a superior officer, threatening behavior toward civilians, public intoxication while in uniform. Even though you were in civilian clothes, you identified yourself as military personnel and conduct unbecoming. These charges could result in court-martial, dishonorable discharge, and civilian criminal charges. Davidson felt the blood drain from his face. A dishonorable discharge would follow him for the rest of his life, affecting his ability to get jobs, housing, even basic services. It was a scarlet letter that would mark him as someone the military had deemed unfit for service. The rest of you, Walsh continued, turning to the other recruits, are being held as witnesses. However, depending on your level of participation in the evening's events, you may also face charges related to conduct unbecoming and failure to prevent misconduct. Master Chief Rodriguez stepped forward, his weathered face showing no sympathy for the young men's plight. Boys, I've been in the Navy for 31 years. I've seen recruits make stupid mistakes before. But assaulting an admiral? That's not a mistake. That's career suicide. Master Chief, Davidson finally spoke, his voice hoarse and uncertain. I didn't know who she was. I swear, I had no idea. Shut up, recruit, Rodriguez snapped. That's exactly the problem. You didn't know who she was, so you thought you could treat her like garbage. You think it would have been okay to assault her if she had just been a regular civilian? Davidson realized he had just made his situation worse. No, Master Chief, that's not what I meant. I know exactly what you meant, Rodriguez cut him off. You meant that you thought you could bully someone you perceived as weaker than you. Someone you thought couldn't fight back. The fact that she turned out to be an admiral just makes your stupidity more obvious. Lieutenant Commander Walsh consulted her notes. Recruit Davidson, multiple witnesses have provided statements about your behavior throughout the evening. According to these reports, you were heard making derogatory comments about SEAL commanders, claiming you could take any of them in a fair fight, and generally disparaging the competence of special operations leadership. The irony was suffocating. Davidson had spent the evening bragging about how he could handle any SEAL commander, only to be effortlessly neutralized by the most senior SEAL commander in the Navy. You also threatened and verbally abused a civilian waitress, Walsh continued. Used your military status to attempt to intimidate other patrons, and ultimately physically assaulted Admiral Chun when she refused to be intimidated by your behavior. What's going to happen to us? Williams asked quietly, speaking for the first time since they had been brought in. That depends on several factors, Walsh replied. The Admiral will have significant input into how this matter is handled. She could choose to press for the maximum penalties, which in Davidson's case could include court-martial and prison time. Or she might choose a more rehabilitative approach. Rodriguez leaned against the wall, studying the four young men with decades of experience reading recruits. The Admiral is a fair officer, but she's also someone who believes in accountability. She didn't get to where she is by accepting excuses or letting misconduct slide. Can we talk to her? Davidson asked desperately. Can I apologize? Explain that I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you did, Rodriguez interrupted. You meant to intimidate someone you thought was weaker than you. You meant to use your military status to bully a civilian. You meant to put your hands on another person when they didn't submit to your demands. The only thing you didn't mean was to get caught doing it to someone who could end your career with a phone call. The holding room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the naval base coming to life in the early morning hours. Dawn was breaking outside, though none of the recruits could see it from their windowless cell. Lieutenant Commander Walsh closed her folder and prepared to leave. You'll be moved to individual cells shortly, where you'll remain until Admiral Chun and the command staff decide how to proceed. I suggest you use the time to think carefully about your actions and their consequences. As the officers prepared to leave, Davidson made one more desperate attempt. Lieutenant Commander, please. My whole life, I've wanted to serve my country. I know I screwed up, but isn't there some way? Walsh turned back to him, her expression showing a mixture of professional detachment and human sympathy. Recruit, wanting to serve your country is admirable. But service requires more than just wanting. It requires character, discipline, and respect for others. Last night, You demonstrated none of those qualities. Your actions reflected poorly on every sailor who has ever worn the uniform, she continued. They dishonored the memory of every service member who has died in the line of duty. And they showed a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service actually means. Rodriguez nodded in agreement. The military isn't about having power over other people, son. It's about sacrificing yourself for something bigger than you are. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves, not bullying them. But I can learn, Davidson pleaded. I can do better. I can be better. Maybe, Rodriguez acknowledged. But that's not up to me to decide. That's up to Admiral Chun and the officers who will review your case. And right now, you've given them very little reason to believe in your potential for improvement. The door clanged shut behind them, leaving the four recruits alone with their thoughts and the growing realization of how completely their lives had changed in the span of a few hours. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away in the base's administrative complex, Admiral Sarah Chun sat in her temporary office reviewing the preliminary reports from the previous evening's incident. She had been called back to the base in the early morning hours to provide her statement and help determine the appropriate response to the situation. Captain Michael Torres, the base commanding officer, sat across from her desk with a steaming cup of coffee and a concerned expression. Sarah, I have to ask, what were you doing in an enlisted personnel bar in the first place? Admiral Chun looked up from the reports, her dark eyes showing a mixture of fatigue and frustration. I wanted a quiet drink somewhere I wouldn't be recognized. Murphy's has a reputation for attracting junior personnel who wouldn't know me on sight. Well, that plan obviously didn't work out, Torres said with a wry smile. No, it didn't, Sarah agreed. But, Mike, the bigger issue here isn't where I was drinking. It's the attitude and behavior we saw from recruit Davidson. This wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. This was a pattern of misconduct that suggests deeper problems with his understanding of military values. Torres nodded, having read the witness statements. The reports are pretty damning. Multiple people heard him disparaging SEAL leadership throughout the evening. He bullied a civilian employee. He attempted to use his military status to intimidate other patrons. And then he escalated to physical assault when you didn't back down. It's the attitude that worries me most, Sarah said, leaning back in her chair. He saw someone he perceived as weak and vulnerable, and his instinct was to exploit that perceived weakness. That's not the mindset we want in our sailors. What do you want to see happen to them? Sarah considered the question carefully. As the victim of the assault, her input would carry significant weight in determining the consequences. She could effectively end Davidson's military career with a recommendation for court-martial and dishonorable discharge. Or she could choose a more rehabilitative approach that might give him a chance to learn from his mistakes. The other 3 can probably be salvaged with the right intervention, she said finally. They were following Davidson's lead, but they didn't actively participate in the misconduct. Some intensive counseling, extra duty, and close supervision might turn them around. And Davidson? That was the more difficult question. Sarah had seen his type before. Young men who used aggression and intimidation to mask their own insecurities and inadequacies. Sometimes they could be reformed with the right combination of discipline and mentoring. Other times, they were simply incompatible with military service. I want to talk to him, Sarah decided. Face to face, without lawyers or master chiefs or anyone else. I want to see if there's anything worth salvaging. Torres raised an eyebrow. That's unusual. Are you sure that's a good idea? Probably not, Sarah admitted. But I've spent my career trying to build better sailors and better people. If there's a chance this kid can learn from what happened, I owe it to him and to the Navy to find out. What if he's just irredeemable? Then we process him out and make sure he understands exactly why he's not fit for military service, Sarah said firmly. But I want to give him one chance to show me who he really is when he's not performing for his friends. An hour later, Admiral Chun walked through the detention facility accompanied by only a single guard. She had changed into her service uniform, complete with the impressive array of ribbons and decorations that told the story of her remarkable career. She wanted Davidson to see exactly who he had assaulted, to understand the full magnitude of his actions. Davidson was alone in his cell when the guard unlocked the door, and Admiral Chun stepped inside. The small space seemed to shrink even further with her presence, and Davidson immediately jumped to attention, his face pale with shock at seeing her again. At ease, recruit, Sarah said quietly. gesturing for him to sit on the narrow cot while she remained standing. "We need to talk." Davidson sat down heavily, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to process the surreal situation of being visited by an admiral in his jail cell. "Do you know who I am?" Sarah asked. "Yes, ma'am. You're Admiral Chun. Do you know what I do?" Davidson swallowed hard. "You're a SEAL commander, ma'am. I heard you were the first woman to command SEALs in combat." "That's right. I've spent the last 20 years of my life leading some of the most elite warriors in the world. I've commanded operations against international terrorists, drug cartels, and hostile foreign forces. I've been shot at, bombed, and targeted for assassination more times than I can count." Davidson stared at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. "But last night," Sarah continued, "I wasn't Admiral Chun. I was just a woman sitting alone in a bar, hoping for a quiet drink. And you decided that woman was a target for your aggression." "Admiral, I'm not finished," Sarah said firmly. "You saw someone you thought was vulnerable, and your instinct was to exploit that vulnerability. You used your military status to try to intimidate what you believed was a civilian. When that didn't work, you escalated to physical violence." Davidson's voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke. "I'm sorry." "Sorry for what, specifically?" The question caught him off guard. For pushing you. For not knowing who you were." "Wrong answer," Sarah said sharply. "You're sorry you got caught assaulting a superior officer. You're sorry your actions have consequences. But you're not sorry for your fundamental approach to the situation." Davidson looked up at her, confusion evident on his face. "Let me ask you this," Sarah continued. "If I'd been just a regular civilian woman, would your actions have been acceptable?" "No, ma'am," Davidson said quickly. "Why not?" Again, the question seemed to catch him off balance. Because you shouldn't assault people?" "That's right. You shouldn't assault anyone, regardless of their rank, their gender, their profession, or their ability to fight back. The fact that I'm an admiral doesn't make your actions worse. It just makes the consequences more severe." Sarah began to pace the small cell, her presence commanding even in the confined space. "Tell me about your upbringing, Davidson. What kind of family did you come from?" "Small town in Ohio, ma'am. My dad worked at the plant, my mom was a teacher. Pretty normal, I guess." "Did they teach you to treat people with respect?" "Yes, ma'am." "Did they teach you that being bigger or stronger than someone gave you the right to hurt them?" "No, ma'am." "Then, where did you learn that behavior?" Davidson struggled to find an answer. "I don't know, ma'am. I guess I just got caught up in trying to impress my friends." Sarah stopped pacing and looked directly at him. "That's the first honest thing you've said since I walked in here. You were performing for your audience, trying to prove your masculinity by dominating someone you perceived as weaker." "Yes, ma'am," Davidson admitted, his voice barely audible. "Do you understand how that makes you fundamentally incompatible with military service?" Davidson looked up sharply. "Mom, the military exists to protect people who can't protect themselves," Sarah explained. "We put ourselves in harm's way so that civilians can sleep safely in their beds. Your instinct is to harm those same civilians when you think no one is watching." The weight of her words seemed to settle on Davidson like a physical force. For the first time since the incident, he appeared to truly understand the magnitude of what he had done. "Is there any hope for me, Admiral?" he asked quietly. Sarah studied him for a long moment, trying to see past the scared young man in front of her to whatever potential might lie beneath. "That depends entirely on you, recruit. Are you willing to do the hard work of becoming a better person? Are you willing to confront the attitudes and behaviors that led you to this moment?" "Yes, ma'am. I'll do whatever it takes." "It won't be easy," Sarah warned. "It will mean acknowledging that everything you thought you knew about strength and respect was wrong. It will mean learning to measure your worth by how well you serve others, not by how well you can dominate them." Davidson nodded eagerly. "I understand, ma'am. Do you? Because this isn't just about saying the right words to avoid punishment. This is about fundamentally changing who you are as a person. And I'm not convinced you have the character for that kind of transformation." The brutal honesty of her assessment hit Davidson like a physical blow. But instead of becoming defensive, he seemed to deflate, finally, accepting the reality of his situation. "What would I have to do?" he asked. "First, you'd have to accept responsibility for your actions without making excuses or blaming anyone else. Second, you'd have to demonstrate genuine remorse. Not just regret about the consequences, but understanding of the harm you caused. Third, you'd have to commit to a program of intensive counseling, community service, and supervised duty that would continue for the remainder of your enlistment. And if I do all that, Then, maybe at the end of your term, you'll have earned the right to call yourself a sailor, Sarah said. But that's a big maybe, Recruit. Most people who end up in your situation don't have what it takes to complete that kind of rehabilitation. Davidson sat in silence for several minutes, processing everything Admiral Chun had told him. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the desperate edge it had carried throughout their conversation. Admiral, I know I don't deserve any consideration from you. I know I've disgraced the uniform and embarrassed the Navy. But if you're willing to give me a chance, I swear I'll spend every day trying to prove I can be better. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of genuine commitment versus mere desperation to avoid punishment. What she saw was a young man who had been forced to confront the worst aspects of his own character and was genuinely horrified by what he had discovered. We'll see, she said finally. Your future isn't up to me alone, but I'll make sure the review board knows that you're willing to participate in a rehabilitation program. As Admiral Chun prepared to leave the cell, Davidson called out one more time. Admiral, thank you for coming to talk to me. No one else would have bothered. Sarah paused at the door and turned back to him. Recruit, I didn't come here for you. I came here for every young sailor who will serve under your command if you somehow manage to salvage your career. I came here for every civilian who might encounter you in a bar someday. And I came here for the honor of a uniform you've disgraced. I understand, ma'am. I hope you do, Sarah said, because this is the last time anyone is going to hold your hand through the consequences of your choices. From here on out, you succeed or fail based entirely on your own character and commitment. With that, Admiral Chun left the detention facility and returned to her duties, carrying with her the hope that perhaps one young man might learn to be better than his worst moment, but knowing that such transformations were rare and difficult to achieve. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the naval base as another day of service began for the thousands of sailors who understood what it truly meant to wear the uniform. 6 months had passed since the incident at Murphy's Bar, and the Norfolk Naval Base had settled into its autumn routine. The leaves on the few trees scattered around the facility had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, providing a sharp contrast to the gray military buildings and the endless expanse of concrete that defined military life. In Building 447, a converted warehouse that served as the base's rehabilitation and counseling center, Recruit Davidson sat across from Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, the civilian psychologist who had been working with him 3 times a week since Admiral Chun had recommended him for the intensive rehabilitation program instead of immediate discharge. The transformation in Davidson's appearance was subtle, but significant. The cocky swagger was gone, replaced by a careful attentiveness that suggested he was constantly evaluating his own behavior. His posture was straighter, more respectful, and there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of seriousness that spoke to someone who had been forced to confront difficult truths about himself. How are you feeling about the community service assignment? Dr. Martinez asked, consulting her notes from their previous sessions. Davidson considered the question carefully before answering. Over the months, he had learned to think before speaking, to examine his motivations and reactions rather than simply responding impulsively. It's been educational, he said finally. Working at the women's shelter has shown me things I never really thought about before. 3 days a week, Davidson spent his off-duty hours at the Harbor Light Women's Shelter, performing maintenance tasks, serving meals, and helping with basic facility operations. It had been Admiral Chen's specific recommendation that his community service involve working with vulnerable populations, particularly women who had experienced violence or intimidation. What kind of things? Dr. Martinez prompted. The stories, Davidson said quietly. These women, some of them are there because men like me, men who thought they had the right to hurt people who couldn't fight back, decided to prove how tough they were. It was a connection that had taken him several months to make. Initially, he had resented the assignment, viewing it as just another punishment designed to humiliate him. But gradually, as he heard the stories of domestic violence, workplace harassment, and random acts of intimidation that had driven these women to seek shelter, he began to understand the pattern of his own behavior. There's this one woman, Maria, Davidson continued. She's probably 40, has 3 kids. She ended up at the shelter because her ex-husband would get drunk and decide he needed to show her who was boss. The way she describes it, it sounds exactly like what I was doing that night at Murphy's. Dr. Martinez nodded encouragingly. What does that make you feel? Sick, Davidson admitted. Ashamed. Like I was part of a system that terrorizes people who don't deserve it. This was progress. In their early sessions, Davidson had been focused primarily on his own situation. The potential consequences to his career, the embarrassment of being disciplined by his superiors, the impact on his family's perception of his military service. But slowly, with patient guidance, he had begun to understand that the real issue wasn't what had happened to him, but what he had done to Admiral Chun and what his attitude represented in the broader context of how power was abused. "Tell me about your supervisor's feedback from the shelter," Dr. Martinez said. "Mrs. Patterson says I'm doing well," Davidson replied. "She said I've stopped trying to take charge of everything and started actually listening when people tell me what needs to be done." This had been one of the hardest lessons for him to learn. Throughout his life, Davidson had equated leadership with dominance, assuming that being strong meant taking control and making others submit to his will. The military had initially seemed to reinforce this belief. After all, wasn't the military about hierarchy and following orders? But his rehabilitation program had included extensive education about the difference between authority and authoritarianism, between leadership and bullying. He had been required to read books about military leadership, study case histories of officers who had failed due to abuse of power, and write lengthy essays examining his own behavior and motivations. "Have you had any contact with your friends from that night?" Dr. Martinez asked. Davidson shook his head. Martinez, Thompson, and Williams were transferred to different assignments after they completed their discipline. The command decided it would be better if we weren't around each other while I was going through rehabilitation. The 3 other recruits had indeed faced consequences for their role in the incident, but nothing as severe as what Davidson had experienced. They had received formal reprimands, extra duty assignments, and mandatory counseling, but their military careers had survived. Davidson sometimes wondered if they resented him for dragging them into his mess, but he had come to understand that wondering about their opinions was less important than focusing on his own growth. "Do you miss having them around?" "Sometimes," Davidson admitted. "But honestly, Dr. Martinez, I think being around them would have made it harder to change. We brought out the worst in each other, you know? We were always trying to prove who was toughest, who could talk the biggest game." "What do you do for social connection now?" This was an ongoing challenge. Davidson's rehabilitation program had been designed to be intensive and isolating, forcing him to confront his own behavior without the distraction of peer pressure or social validation. But it also meant he had been essentially alone for 6 months, with his only regular social interactions being his counseling sessions, his work supervisors, and the staff and residents at the women's shelter. "I write letters to my family," Davidson said, "and I've been talking to some of the other sailors in my work detail. There's this petty officer, Santos, who's been in the Navy for 8 years. He's been kind of mentoring me, I guess." Petty Officer Second Class Carlos Santos had indeed taken an interest in Davidson's case, though not out of sympathy. Santos had grown up in a rough neighborhood in Los Angeles and had seen too many young men destroy their lives through violence and machismo. When he learned about Davidson's situation, he had volunteered to provide informal mentorship as part of the rehabilitation program. "Santos doesn't let me get away with anything," Davidson continued. "If I start making excuses or feeling sorry for myself, he calls me on it immediately. But he also talks to me about what it really means to be a sailor." "What does it mean?" "Service before self," Davidson said, reciting what had become his daily mantra. "It means putting the mission and other people ahead of your own ego or your own comfort. It means being someone that civilians can trust to protect them, not someone they need protection from." Dr. Martinez made a note in her file. "How do you feel about Admiral Chun now?" This question always made Davidson uncomfortable, not because he harbored resentment toward the Admiral, but because he was still processing his complex feelings about what had happened that night. "I'm grateful to her," he said slowly. "She could have ended my career with one recommendation. Instead, she gave me a chance to prove I could be better. I know I don't deserve that kind of consideration." But Davidson looked up sharply. Dr. Martinez had a talent for sensing the unspoken reservations in his responses. "But sometimes I wonder if she sees this whole thing as an experiment," Davidson admitted. "Like she's testing whether someone like me can actually change, or if she's just documenting the failure for future reference. What would be wrong with that? Nothing, I guess. It's just, it makes me feel like a lab rat sometimes. Like my whole future depends on proving something to someone who has every reason to expect me to fail. Is that pressure helpful or harmful to your progress?" Davidson considered this question carefully. "Probably helpful, even though it's stressful. It keeps me focused on the fact that this isn't just about completing a program and getting back to normal duty. It's about becoming someone who deserves to wear the uniform. Their session was interrupted by a knock on the door. Dr. Martinez's secretary entered with a message that Davidson was needed immediately at the base command center. Such interruptions were unusual. Davidson's schedule was carefully controlled as part of his rehabilitation program. 20 minutes later, Davidson found himself standing at attention in Captain Torres's office, facing not only the base commanding officer, but also Admiral Chen herself. It was the first time he had seen her since their conversation in the detention facility 6 months earlier. At ease, recruit, Captain Torres said. Davidson shifted to a more relaxed position, but remained alert and respectful. Davidson, Admiral Chen began, we've called you here because a situation has developed that may impact your rehabilitation program. Davidson felt his stomach drop. Had he done something wrong? Had someone complained about his behavior at the shelter? Had the Navy decided that his rehabilitation was unsuccessful? There's been an incident involving one of the women at Harbor Light Shelter, Admiral Chen continued. Maria Gonzalez. I believe you know her. Davidson's blood ran cold. Maria was indeed one of the residents he had gotten to know during his community service. She was a single mother whose abusive ex-husband had been stalking her despite a restraining order. Is she okay, Admiral? She's alive, Captain Torres said grimly. Her ex-husband broke into the shelter 3 nights ago. He was armed and apparently intended to force her to leave with him. What happened? Davidson asked, though he dreaded the answer. Admiral Chen consulted a report in her hands. According to the police report and witness statements, you were working late that evening, cleaning the kitchen after dinner service. When you heard screaming from the residential wing, you immediately went to investigate. Davidson remembered the night clearly. He had been washing industrial-sized pots when he heard Maria's terrified screams echoing through the building. Without thinking, he had dropped everything and ran toward the sound. You confronted an armed man who was threatening a woman you had worked with for months, Admiral Chen continued. A man who was bigger than you, intoxicated, and had already demonstrated a willingness to use violence. I couldn't just let him hurt her, Davidson said quietly. According to Maria's statement, you placed yourself between her and her attacker. You talked him down from his initial rage and managed to keep him occupied until the police arrived. No shots were fired, no one was seriously injured, and Maria's children were kept safe throughout the incident. Captain Torres leaned forward in his chair. Davidson, do you understand what you did that night? I did what anyone would have done, sir. Maria needed help. No, Admiral Chen said firmly. What you did was exactly what a sailor is supposed to do. You put yourself at risk to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. You used your training and your judgment to de-escalate a dangerous situation. You embodied the values that we try to instill in every person who wears the uniform. Davidson stood in stunned silence, trying to process what he was hearing. The incident has been thoroughly investigated, Captain Torres added. The police interviewed everyone involved, including Maria, the other shelter residents who witnessed the event, and the staff members who were present. Every single account describes your actions as heroic, professional, and exactly what we would expect from a Navy sailor. Admiral Chen studied Davidson's face carefully. How do you feel about what happened? Honestly, Admiral, I barely remember making a conscious decision. I heard Maria screaming, and I just reacted. It wasn't until later that I realized how dangerous the situation was. That's exactly the point, Admiral Chen said. When the moment came to choose between your own safety and protecting someone else, you made the right choice instinctively. That suggests that your rehabilitation program has been successful in ways that go beyond just completing assignments and attending counseling sessions. Does this mean... Davidson began, then stopped himself. Does this mean what? Captain Torres prompted. Does this mean I might actually have a future in the Navy? Admiral Chen and Captain Torres exchanged a look before the Admiral responded. Davidson, your rehabilitation program was always designed with the possibility of eventual reinstatement to full duty status. What happened at the shelter demonstrates that you've internalized the values we've been trying to teach you. But, Captain Torres added, this doesn't mean your rehabilitation is complete. You still have several months of programming remaining, and you'll continue to be closely supervised even after you return to regular duty. However, Admiral Chen said, we're recommending that you be transferred to a more challenging assignment as the next phase of your development. Instead of general labor and community service, you'll be assigned to work directly with at-risk youth in the base's mentorship program. Davidson felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. What would that involve, Admiral? You'd work with teenagers from military families who are struggling with behavioral issues, academic problems, or family instability. You'd help them with homework, participate in recreational activities, and serve as a positive role model. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Davidson, who had been disciplined for his own behavioral issues, would now be responsible for helping other young people avoid the same mistakes he had made. Why me? Davidson asked. Because you understand what it's like to make serious mistakes and face serious consequences, Admiral Chen explained. Because you've done the hard work of examining your own behavior and changing it. And because you've now demonstrated that you can put other people's welfare ahead of your own comfort or safety. Also, Captain Torres added, because the young people in this program need to see that it's possible to come back from serious mistakes. They need to understand that bad choices don't have to define the rest of your life if you're willing to do the work to change. Davidson thought about Maria, about the other women at the shelter, about the months of counseling and self-examination he had endured. I'd be honored to try, Admiral. But what if I'm not good at it? What if I can't help them? Then, you'll learn from that too, Admiral Chen said. Davidson, the Navy isn't looking for perfection. We're looking for people who can grow, who can learn from their mistakes, and who can become better versions of themselves. You've demonstrated all of those qualities. As the meeting concluded, Admiral Chen asked Davidson to remain behind for a private conversation. When Captain Torres had left, she turned to face him directly. Davidson, I want you to understand something. What happened that night at the shelter wasn't just about your rehabilitation program. It was about who you've chosen to become. I don't understand, Admiral. 6 months ago, you saw someone you perceived as vulnerable, and your instinct was to exploit that vulnerability. Last week, you saw someone who was actually vulnerable, and your instinct was to protect them. That's not just behavioral modification. That's fundamental character change. Davidson felt the weight of her words settling on him. Do you think I can actually make it as a sailor? Admiral Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the same intensity she had shown during their first conversation in the detention cell. I think you have the potential to become exactly the kind of sailor the Navy needs, she said finally. But potential isn't enough. You'll have to choose every day to live up to the values you've learned. You'll have to resist the temptation to fall back into old patterns when things get difficult. I will, Admiral. I promise. Don't promise me, Admiral Chen said. Promise Maria. Promise every young person you'll work with in the mentorship program. Promise every civilian who sees you in uniform, and trust that you'll protect them rather than harm them. As Davidson left the command center that afternoon, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Genuine hope for his future. But more than that, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond just salvaging his military career. He thought about the scared teenagers he would soon be working with, young people who were probably making some of the same mistakes he had made, driven by the same insecurities and misguided ideas about strength and respect. Maybe, he thought, he could help them find a better path before they destroyed their own futures. Maybe his own failure could become the foundation for someone else's success. It was a humbling thought, but also an inspiring one. For the first time since that night at Murphy's Bar, Davidson began to see his future not as something he was desperately trying to salvage, but as something he could actively build into something meaningful and valuable. The autumn sun was setting over Norfolk Naval Base as Davidson walked back to his barracks, already planning how he would approach his new responsibilities. He had learned that being strong didn't mean dominating others. It meant protecting them. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly strong. 2 years had passed since the incident at Murphy's Bar, and Petty Officer 3rd Class Davidson stood at the edge of the basketball court at Norfolk Naval Base's youth center, watching a group of teenagers who reminded him painfully of his former self. The autumn afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the gymnasium, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor where 15 young people between the ages of 14 and 17 were engaged in what could charitably be called a basketball game. More accurately, it was a showcase of adolescent aggression, poor sportsmanship, and the kind of toxic competitiveness that Davidson had once thought was normal. 2 players had already been ejected for fighting, and the remaining participants seemed more interested in settling personal scores than actually playing basketball. Time out, Davidson called, blowing his whistle sharply. The game stopped, though several players continued glaring at each other with the intensity of mortal enemies. Line up on the baseline, Davidson instructed, his voice carrying the authority he had learned to project without aggression. Everyone. The teenagers complied reluctantly, their body language radiating defiance and barely contained hostility. Davidson looked at each face individually, seeing in them echoes of his own angry, confused younger self. There was Marcus, 16 years old, whose father was deployed overseas and whose mother worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat. Marcus had been acting out in school and had already been suspended twice for fighting. His anger was a mask for the fear and abandonment he felt with his father gone and his mother constantly absent. Next to him stood Jessica, 15, whose parents were going through a bitter divorce that had turned their home into a war zone. She had started hanging out with older kids who introduced her to drinking and petty crime. Her rebellion was her way of trying to control something in a life that felt completely chaotic. At the end of the line, Tommy Sullivan, 14 years old and the youngest in the group, bounced nervously on his toes. His father was a master chief who expected perfection from his son and responded to any failure with harsh criticism and punishment. Tommy's aggressive behavior was his attempt to prove he was tough enough to earn his father's approval. Davidson had been working with this particular group for 8 months, and while some progress had been made, days like today reminded him how fragile that progress could be and how easily these young people could fall back into destructive patterns. "What just happened out there?" Davidson asked, his voice calm but serious. "Marcus was fouling me on purpose," Jessica said immediately, her voice rising with indignation. "Because you were trash talking my family." Marcus shot back, taking a step toward her. "Both of you stop," Davidson said firmly, positioning himself between them. "Marcus, step back." "Jessica, explain what happened without blaming anyone else." This was one of the techniques Dr. Martinez had taught him during his own rehabilitation, forcing people to take responsibility for their own actions without immediately shifting blame to others. It was harder than it sounded, especially for teenagers who had learned to see themselves as victims of circumstances beyond their control. "She said something about my dad not caring enough to stick around," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's not her business." "And what did you do in response?" Davidson asked. Marcus looked down at his shoes. "I fouled her hard on the next play." "Was that an appropriate response to someone saying something that hurt your feelings?" "No," Marcus admitted reluctantly. Davidson turned to Jessica. "What did you say exactly?" "I just said maybe if his dad actually cared about him, he'd find a way to be around more instead of choosing to deploy all the time," Jessica said, her tone defensive. "How do you think that made Marcus feel?" Jessica shrugged, but Davidson could see the guilt in her eyes. "Probably bad." "Why did you say it?" This was the harder question, the one that forced people to examine their motivations rather than just their actions. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, and Davidson waited patiently. He had learned that rushing these conversations only led to superficial responses that didn't create real understanding. "Because he was playing better than me, and I was frustrated," Jessica finally admitted. "I wanted to hurt his feelings." "And did it work?" "Yeah," Jessica said quietly. "Did it make you feel better?" "For like 2 seconds. Then I felt worse." This was progress. 8 months ago, Jessica would have denied saying anything hurtful at all, then blamed Marcus for being too sensitive, then stormed out of the gym. The fact that she could now acknowledge her motivations and their consequences showed that she was developing the kind of self-awareness that Davidson had been forced to cultivate during his own rehabilitation. "Tommy," Davidson said, turning to the youngest member of the group, "what did you observe during this situation?" Tommy looked uncomfortable being put on the spot. "I don't know. They were both being stupid." "That's not an observation. That's a judgment," Davidson corrected gently. "Tell me what you saw and heard, not what you think about it." Jessica said something mean about Marcus's dad. Marcus got angry and fouled her hard on purpose. Then they started yelling at each other. "Good. Now, what do you think each of them was feeling?" This exercise in emotional intelligence had been one of the most difficult aspects of Davidson's own growth. Like many young men raised in traditional masculine culture, he had been taught to ignore emotions, to see them as weaknesses to be suppressed rather than information to be processed. Marcus was probably hurt and angry, Tommy said slowly. Jessica was, I don't know, maybe frustrated. Why might Jessica have been frustrated? Because she was losing? Possibly. What else might frustrate someone during a basketball game? Tommy thought about this. Maybe she felt like she wasn't good enough, like everyone was playing better than her. That's very insightful, Tommy. How might those feelings lead to the behavior we saw? If you feel bad about yourself, maybe you try to make other people feel bad too? Davidson smiled. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough he had hoped to see. That's exactly right. Sometimes when we're feeling insecure or inadequate, we try to bring other people down to our level instead of working to bring ourselves up. He turned back to the whole group. This is something all of you need to understand. Every single person in this room has felt inadequate, frustrated, angry, or scared. Those feelings are normal. But what you do with those feelings determines whether you become someone people respect and trust or someone people avoid and fear. Marcus raised his hand tentatively. What do you mean? I mean that you can choose to use your emotions as information to help you understand what you need to work on, or you can use them as weapons to hurt other people. One choice makes you stronger, the other makes you weaker. This was a lesson Davidson had learned the hard way, first during his confrontation with Admiral Chun, then through months of counseling and self-examination. The realization that his aggression had been a mask for his own insecurity had been one of the most difficult truths he had ever faced. Can you give us an example? Jessica asked, and Davidson could hear genuine curiosity in her voice rather than the challenging tone she usually used. Davidson considered how much of his own story to share. Over the 2 years he had been working with at-risk youth, he had learned that selective vulnerability could be a powerful teaching tool, but it had to be carefully managed to avoid becoming the center of attention or overwhelming young people who were dealing with their own problems. When I was about your age, Davidson began, I felt like I constantly had to prove how tough I was. If someone disrespected me, or if I felt like someone was making me look weak, my immediate reaction was to get aggressive. What changed? Tommy asked. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it, Davidson said simply. Someone who was actually much stronger than me, but who I targeted because I thought they were weak. And the consequences of that mistake forced me to examine why I felt the need to hurt other people in the first place. What did you figure out? Marcus asked. That I was scared. Scared that I wasn't strong enough, smart enough, good enough. Scared that if people saw who I really was, they wouldn't respect me. So I tried to hide that fear by being aggressive and intimidating. The gymnasium had grown quiet. Davidson could see that his words were resonating with the teenagers, many of whom were dealing with the same fears and insecurities that had driven his own destructive behavior. The problem with that approach, Davidson continued, is that it doesn't actually make you stronger. It just makes you someone that other people can't trust. And if people can't trust you, then any respect they show you is really just fear, which means it's not real respect at all. So what do you do when you feel scared or angry? Jessica asked. You use those feelings as information, Davidson explained. If you're angry, ask yourself what's really bothering you. If you're scared, ask yourself what you're actually afraid of. Then you can address the real problem instead of just lashing out at whoever happens to be nearby. He gestured toward Marcus and Jessica. Marcus, when Jessica said something about your father, what were you really afraid of? Marcus thought about this question seriously. I guess. I'm afraid that maybe she's right. Maybe he could find a way to be around more if he really wanted to. And Jessica, when you were getting frustrated during the game, what were you really worried about? That everyone would think I'm not good at basketball, Jessica admitted. That I don't belong here. So instead of working together to help each other get better at basketball, you ended up hurting each other emotionally. Does that make sense? Both teenagers shook their heads. What would have been a better approach? I could have asked Marcus to help me with my defense instead of trying to make him feel bad, Jessica said slowly. And I could have told Jessica good job when she made a good play instead of just focusing on beating her, Marcus added. Davidson felt a familiar surge of satisfaction. These moments of genuine insight were what made his work meaningful. What transformed his own painful experience into something that could help other people avoid the same mistakes. Let's try playing again, Davidson suggested. But this time, I want you to practice using your emotions as information instead of weapons. If you start feeling frustrated, angry, or scared, stop and ask yourself what that feeling is telling you about what you need to work on. As the teenagers returned to the basketball court, Davidson reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 2 years ago, he had been facing the end of his military career and possible criminal charges. Today, he was a trusted mentor helping young people navigate the same emotional challenges that had nearly destroyed his own life. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. Even now, Davidson sometimes felt the old impulses toward aggression and dominance especially when he was tired, stressed, or feeling insecure about his own abilities. But he had learned to recognize those impulses for what they were: information about his own emotional state, rather than commands to be obeyed. His phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Martinez, who still met with him monthly to check on his progress. Observation session tomorrow at 2 p.m. Looking forward to seeing how the group is doing. Davidson smiled. The observation sessions had initially made him nervous, feeling like he was being evaluated and judged. But he had come to appreciate Dr. Martinez's insights and feedback, which helped him become more effective in his work with the teenagers. As the basketball game resumed, Davidson noticed immediate differences in the players' behavior. Instead of trying to dominate each other, they were communicating more, offering encouragement, and actually playing as a team. When conflicts arose, they were addressing them directly rather than letting them escalate into personal attacks. "Nice pass, Marcus," Jessica called out after he set her up for an easy basket. "Good defense, Jess," Marcus replied when she successfully stole the ball from an opponent. These small moments of mutual respect and encouragement might seem insignificant to an outside observer, but Davidson knew they represented fundamental shifts in how these young people were choosing to relate to each other. Instead of seeing each other as threats to be defeated or obstacles to be overcome, they were learning to see each other as teammates working toward common goals. After practice, as the teenagers gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, Marcus approached Davidson with an expression of serious concern. "Petty Officer Davidson," Marcus began, using the formal title that Davidson had insisted upon despite the informal atmosphere of their sessions. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course," Davidson replied, gesturing toward the bleachers where they could sit and talk privately. "That person you said you hurt when you were younger," Marcus said carefully. "Did they forgive you?" The question caught Davidson off guard. In all his months of working with these teenagers, none of them had ever asked about Admiral Chun or the specific circumstances that had led to his rehabilitation program. "That's complicated," Davidson said honestly. "The person I hurt was someone very important, someone who had the power to end my career permanently. Instead, they gave me a chance to prove I could be better." "But did they forgive you?" Davidson considered this question carefully. "I think they gave me the opportunity to earn forgiveness through my actions rather than just my words. Forgiveness isn't something you can demand or expect. It's something you have to prove you deserve." "Are you still trying to prove it?" "Every day," Davidson admitted. "Not just to them, but to everyone who trusts me with responsibility. To you and the other kids in this program. To the Navy. To myself." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I think I need to apologize to my mom." "What for?" "For being angry at her all the time because Dad's not around. It's not her fault he's deployed, and she's doing her best to take care of us by herself." Davidson felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The emotion that came when he witnessed someone else making the kind of breakthrough that could change the trajectory of their life. "That sounds like a mature decision," Davidson said. "How do you think you'll approach that conversation?" "I'm going to tell her that I know she's working hard and that I'm sorry for making things harder for her. And I'm going to ask if there's anything I can do to help out more at home." That's exactly the kind of thinking that will make you a good man, Marcus. Taking responsibility for your own behavior and looking for ways to help instead of ways to blame. As Marcus left the gymnasium, Davidson stayed behind to clean up the equipment and reflect on the day's events. These conversations with the teenagers had become one of the most meaningful parts of his life, but they also forced him to continually examine his own growth and motivations. His phone rang, displaying a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, the voice on the other end made his heart skip a beat. "Petty Officer Davidson? This is Admiral Chun. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Davidson's mouth went dry. He hadn't spoken directly to Admiral Chun since their meeting 2 years ago when his assignment to the Youth Mentorship Program had been approved. "Of course, Admiral. How can I help you?" "I've been receiving reports about your work with the At-Risk Youth Program. Very positive reports. I wanted to speak with you about a potential new opportunity." Davidson felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "What kind of opportunity, Admiral?" "The Navy is developing a new program for young sailors who are struggling with behavioral issues, similar to what you experienced, but designed to intervene before situations reach the crisis point. We need experienced personnel who understand both the problems these sailors are facing and the kind of intervention that can be effective." "You want me to work with problem sailors?" "I want you to help develop and implement a program that could prevent other young people from making the same mistakes you made." You'd be working directly with sailors who are showing early warning signs of the kind of behavior that got you into trouble. Davidson was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what Admiral Chan was suggesting. Admiral, do you think I'm ready for that kind of responsibility? Davidson, 2 years ago, you were facing the end of your career because you couldn't control your own behavior. Today, you're successfully helping teenagers learn the same emotional regulation and conflict resolution skills that you had to develop. You've demonstrated not just that you can change, but that you can help others change. But what if I mess up? What if I'm not good enough to help other sailors? Admiral Chen's voice carried a note of gentle amusement. Davidson, do you remember what you told me 2 years ago when I asked if you were willing to do the hard work of becoming a better person? I said I'd do whatever it takes. And you have. Every report I've received describes someone who takes his responsibilities seriously, who connects well with young people, and who has learned to use his own experiences constructively. You've earned this opportunity. Davidson thought about Marcus, Jessica, Tommy, and all the other young people he had worked with over the past 2 years. He thought about Maria at the women's shelter, about the night he had put himself between her and danger without thinking about his own safety. He thought about the long months of counseling, self-examination, and gradual growth that had brought him to this moment. What would the program involve, he asked. You'd help design intervention protocols, train other personnel in conflict de-escalation techniques, and work directly with sailors who are struggling. It would require additional training, probably some travel to other bases, and definitely more responsibility than you've had before. Would I still be able to work with the youth program? That would depend on your schedule and the needs of both programs. But, Davidson, I want you to understand something. This isn't charity or a sympathy assignment. The Navy needs people who understand what it's like to fail and recover, who can relate to sailors who are struggling without condescending to them. Davidson thought about his conversation with Marcus earlier, about the importance of earning forgiveness through actions rather than words. This opportunity seemed like another chance to prove that his rehabilitation had been genuine, that he could contribute something valuable to the Navy rather than just avoiding further trouble. Admiral, I'd be honored to be considered for the program. Good. Report to my office next Monday at 0800. We'll discuss the details and see if this is the right fit for both you and the Navy. After the call ended, Davidson sat alone in the empty gymnasium, surrounded by the echoes of teenage voices and the lingering smell of athletic equipment. 2 years ago, he had been convinced that his life was over, that one night of poor judgment had destroyed any chance he had of building something meaningful. Now, he was being offered the opportunity to help prevent other people from making the same mistakes, to transform his own failure into a resource for helping others succeed. It was more than he had dared to hope for when he was sitting in that detention cell, wondering if Admiral Chan would give him any chance at redemption. As he turned off the lights and locked up the gymnasium, Davidson thought about the teenagers he had been working with and the young sailors he might soon be helping. Each of them was facing the same fundamental challenge he had faced, learning to be strong without being destructive, learning to deal with difficult emotions without hurting other people, learning to find their place in the world without diminishing anyone else's. It was difficult work, requiring patience, humility, and the kind of emotional intelligence that didn't come naturally to most people. But it was also the most meaningful work Davidson had ever done, because it addressed the root causes of the kind of behavior that had almost destroyed his own life. Walking across the base in the gathering twilight, Davidson felt something he had never experienced before: genuine pride in who he had become and excitement about who he might still become. The angry, insecure young man who had shoved Admiral Chun in a Norfolk bar was still part of his history, but that person no longer defined his identity or limited his possibilities. Tomorrow, he would continue working with Marcus, Jessica, Tommy, and the others, helping them navigate their own emotional challenges and build the kind of character that would serve them well throughout their lives. Next week, he would begin exploring how to expand that work to help struggling sailors avoid the kind of crisis that had almost ended his own career. It was a future built on the foundation of past failure, but strengthened by the hard work of growth, change, and service to others. For the first time in his life, Davidson understood what it truly meant to be strong, not because he could dominate others, but because he could help them become stronger themselves. The Norfolk Naval Base was settling into evening routine around him, thousands of sailors going about the business of serving their country with honor and distinction. And for the first time since he had joined the Navy, Davidson felt like he truly belonged among them, not because he had avoided making mistakes, but because he had learned to grow from them and use them to help others. The future stretched ahead of him, full of challenges and opportunities he could barely imagine. But he was ready for whatever came next, grounded in the knowledge that real strength came not from never falling, but from learning to get back up and help others do the same. 5 years had passed since that fateful night at Murphy's Bar, and Lieutenant Junior Gray Davidson stood in the conference room at Naval Station San Diego, looking out at an audience of junior officers, senior enlisted personnel, and civilian contractors who had gathered for his presentation on the Navy's innovative early intervention program for at-risk personnel. The transformation in Davidson's appearance was striking. Gone was the cocky swagger and barely contained aggression that had characterized his younger self. In its place was the composed bearing of someone who had learned to channel his intensity into purpose rather than destructive behavior. At 28, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his authority through service rather than demanding it through intimidation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Davidson began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. 3 years ago, the Navy implemented the early intervention program based on a simple premise: that we can identify and address behavioral problems before they become career-ending incidents. On the screen behind him, statistics displayed the program's impressive results. A 60% reduction in serious disciplinary incidents among participants. An 85% retention rate for sailors who completed the program. Most importantly, a measurable improvement in unit cohesion and morale wherever the program had been implemented. The key insight that drives this program, Davidson continued, is that most behavioral problems in military personnel stem not from inherent character flaws, but from unaddressed emotional issues, inadequate coping mechanisms, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what military strength actually means. In the audience, Admiral Chun watched with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal pride. She had taken considerable risk in recommending Davidson for the rehabilitation program 5 years earlier, and even more risk in supporting his advancement to positions of greater responsibility. But the young officer presenting to this distinguished audience was living proof that people could change in fundamental ways if given the proper support and held to appropriate standards. Beside her sat Captain Martinez, who had started as Davidson's counselor and had become one of his closest mentors and advocates. She was particularly interested in seeing how Davidson would handle the question and answer session, knowing that some in the audience might be skeptical of advice from someone who had once faced court-martial himself. The program operates on 3 core principles, Davidson explained, advancing to his next slide. First, early identification through behavioral monitoring and peer reporting. Second, immediate intervention before problems escalate. Third, comprehensive support that addresses root causes rather than just symptoms. A hand shot up from the audience. Commander Roberts, a veteran destroyer captain known for his traditional approach to naval discipline, had the kind of skeptical expression that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by what he was hearing. "Lieutenant Davidson," Commander Roberts said, "this all sounds very nice in theory, but aren't we just coddling sailors who can't handle the demands of military service? In my experience, people who can't control their behavior are simply not suited for the Navy." Davidson had expected this type of challenge and had learned to address it without becoming defensive. "Commander, that's an excellent question, and it goes to the heart of what military service actually requires. Can you tell me what you think are the most important qualities in a combat effective sailor?" "Discipline, loyalty, physical courage, and the ability to follow orders under extreme stress," Roberts replied immediately. "I agree completely," Davidson said. "Now, do any of those qualities require treating civilians disrespectfully, bullying subordinates, or using violence to solve interpersonal conflicts?" "Of course not," Roberts said, looking slightly annoyed at what seemed like an obvious question. "Then, we're on the same page," Davidson replied smoothly. "The behaviors that get sailors into serious disciplinary trouble, sexual harassment, assault, domestic violence, substance abuse, are not expressions of military virtues. They're failures of character that actually undermine military effectiveness." He clicked to his next slide, showing case studies from units that had implemented the program. "What we found is that sailors who complete early intervention training don't just avoid disciplinary problems. They become better leaders, more trusted teammates, and more effective representatives of naval values." Commander Roberts seemed to be considering this perspective, but he pressed further. What about accountability? If we're helping people instead of punishing them, what message does that send about personal responsibility? This was the question Davidson had been most prepared for, because it addressed his own journey most directly. Commander, accountability and rehabilitation aren't mutually exclusive, Davidson said. In fact, real accountability requires more than just punishment. It requires changing the behavior that caused the problem in the first place. He paused, making a decision to share more of his personal story than he typically did in professional presentations. I can speak to this from personal experience, Davidson continued, and Admiral Chun leaned forward slightly, curious about how much he would reveal. 6 years ago, I was facing court-martial for assaulting a superior officer. My chain of command could have simply processed me out of the Navy as unsuitable for continued service. The room grew very quiet. Several attendees exchanged glances, realizing they were hearing something more personal than a typical program briefing. Instead, I was given the opportunity to participate in an intensive rehabilitation program that forced me to confront the attitudes and behaviors that had led to my misconduct. That program was harder, more demanding, and required more accountability than any punishment could have provided. Davidson looked directly at Commander Roberts as he continued. I had to examine every aspect of my character, understand why I had chosen to hurt another person, and demonstrate through my actions that I could become someone worthy of wearing the uniform. It took years of work, constant supervision, and repeated proof that I had changed. And you think that approach is better than simply removing problem personnel? Roberts asked, his tone now more curious than challenging. I think it's better for the individual, better for the Navy, and better for society, Davidson replied. The sailor who attacked a superior officer 6 years ago was a liability to everyone around him. The officer standing before you today has spent the last 3 years helping other sailors avoid the same mistakes and has contributed to measurable improvements in unit effectiveness wherever this program has been implemented. A different voice spoke up from the back of the room. Lieutenant Davidson, how do you identify which sailors can benefit from intervention versus those who should simply be separated? That's one of the most important aspects of the program, Davidson said, grateful to move to more concrete operational details. We use a combination of behavioral indicators, psychological assessment, and peer feedback to evaluate both the severity of the problem and the individual's potential for growth. He advanced to a slide showing the assessment criteria. Key factors include willingness to accept responsibility, capacity for self-reflection, support systems outside the military, and demonstration of core empathy and moral reasoning. Sailors who lack these foundations are generally not good candidates for intervention. What about success rates? Asked Lieutenant Commander Walsh, the legal officer who had been present during Davidson's own disciplinary proceedings years earlier. 85% of sailors who complete the full program show sustained behavioral improvement over a 2-year follow-up period, Davidson replied. Of the 15% who don't succeed, most are identified for separation within the first 6 months, so we're not investing extensive resources in hopeless cases. Admiral Chun decided to add her perspective to the discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been monitoring this program since its inception, and I want to emphasize something important. This isn't about lowering standards or making excuses for misconduct. If anything, we're holding people to higher standards by requiring them to demonstrate real change rather than just serving punishment and returning to duty. She stood up, commanding immediate attention throughout the room. Lieutenant Davidson represents exactly what we're trying to accomplish. We took a sailor who had made serious mistakes and, through intensive intervention and accountability, developed him into someone who now helps prevent other sailors from making similar mistakes. The return on investment has been extraordinary. Commander Roberts raised his hand again. Admiral, I have to ask, weren't you taking a considerable risk by recommending rehabilitation over separation for someone who had assaulted you personally? Admiral Chun smiled slightly. Absolutely. But leadership requires taking calculated risks for the benefit of the organization and the individuals within it. The question wasn't whether rehabilitation was risky. It was whether the potential benefits justified the risk. And do you believe they did? The results speak for themselves, Admiral Chun replied. Lieutenant Davidson has directly worked with over 300 at-risk sailors, with a success rate that exceeds our most optimistic projections. He's helped develop training protocols that are now being used throughout the fleet. Most importantly, he's demonstrated that people can change in fundamental ways if they're given appropriate support and held to appropriate standards. During the break that followed, several officers approached Davidson with specific questions about implementing the program in their own units. But the conversation that meant the most to him came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Davidson? The voice belonged to a young petty officer second class who looked nervous about approaching such a senior gathering. Yes, petty officer? Collins, sir. I just wanted to thank you for what you said in there. I've been struggling with some of the same issues you talked about, and hearing that someone could come back from serious mistakes, it gives me hope. Davidson studied the young man's face, seeing echoes of his own younger self. What kind of struggles, if you don't mind me asking? Anger management, mostly. I grew up in a pretty rough neighborhood, and my first instinct when someone disrespects me is to get aggressive. I've had a couple of incidents, nothing serious yet, but I can see where this is heading. Are you interested in getting help with those issues? Yes, sir, but I'm worried that asking for help will hurt my career. People might think I'm not suited for military service. Davidson pulled out his business card and handed it to Collins. Petty officer, asking for help when you recognize a problem shows exactly the kind of maturity and self-awareness that we want in our sailors. Contact me next week, and I'll put you in touch with resources that can help you develop better coping strategies. Thank you, sir. Can I ask you something else? Of course. Do you ever regret the mistakes you made? I mean, would your life have been better if you'd never had those problems in the first place? It was a question Davidson had asked himself many times over the years. The honest answer was complicated, but Collins deserved honesty rather than platitudes. I regret the pain I caused other people, Davidson said carefully. I regret the disrespect I showed to the uniform and the values it represents. But do I regret the journey that brought me to where I am today? No, I don't. Why not? Because my mistakes taught me things about myself and about leadership that I never would have learned otherwise. They forced me to develop character traits I didn't even know I was missing. And they put me in a position to help other people avoid the same painful lessons. Collins nodded thoughtfully. So sometimes bad things can lead to good outcomes. Sometimes, Davidson agreed. But only if you're willing to do the hard work of learning from them and using them to become a better person. The mistakes themselves aren't valuable. What's valuable is what you choose to do with them afterward. As the afternoon session resumed, Admiral Chun took the podium to discuss the program's expansion plans. Based on the success we've seen over the past 3 years, the Navy is implementing early intervention programs at 15 additional installations over the next 18 months. She gestured toward Davidson. Lieutenant Davidson will be leading the implementation team, working directly with commanding officers and senior enlisted personnel to adapt the program to local needs and circumstances. The promotion and increased responsibility represented a remarkable transformation for someone who had once faced the end of his military career. But more than personal advancement, it represented validation of the principle that people could change and that investment in human development could yield extraordinary returns. After the presentation concluded, Admiral Chun asked Davidson to join her for a private conversation in her office. The walk across the base gave them a chance to reflect on how far they had both come since that night at Murphy's Bar. How does it feel? Admiral Chun asked as they settled into her office chairs. Surreal, Davidson admitted. 6 years ago, I was convinced my life was over. Today, I'm being trusted with responsibility for helping other people rebuild their lives. Sometimes I have to remind myself that this is really my life now. Do you think about that night often? Every day, Davidson said without hesitation. Not in a way that's destructive or obsessive, but as a reminder of how quickly things can change and how important it is to stay vigilant about my own behavior and motivations. Admiral Chin nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach. The moment you start taking your growth for granted is the moment you become vulnerable to falling back into old patterns. Admiral, can I ask you something I've always wondered about? Of course. When you decided to recommend rehabilitation instead of separation, did you really believe I could change? Or were you just giving me enough rope to hang myself? Admiral Chun was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer honestly. I believe you had the potential to change, but I wasn't certain you would choose to do the work required for real transformation. What convinced me to take the risk was your response during our conversation in the detention cell. What about it? You asked what you would have to do to become better, not what you could say to avoid punishment. that suggested you were beginning to understand the difference between manipulation and genuine accountability. And now I'm convinced that taking that risk was one of the best decisions I've made in my career, Admiral Chin said firmly. Not just because of what you've accomplished, but because of what your success demonstrates about the potential for human growth and redemption. As their conversation wound down, Admiral Chun had one final thought to share. Davidson, I want you to remember something as you take on this expanded role. You're not just helping individual sailors. You're changing the culture of the Navy to be more focused on development rather than just punishment. That's a big responsibility. It is. But you've earned the right to carry it through your own transformation and your demonstrated ability to help others achieve similar growth. Walking back to his quarters that evening, Lieutenant Davidson reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought him from the detention cell at Norfolk to a leadership position in one of the Navy's most innovative programs. The path had been difficult, demanding, and often humbling, but it had led to a life of purpose and meaning that exceeded anything he could have imagined. Tomorrow, he would begin working with a new group of struggling sailors, each facing their own version of the crisis that had nearly destroyed his own career. Some would embrace the opportunity for growth and transformation. Others would resist change and ultimately be separated from a service. But all of them would be given the same chance he had received, to prove that their worst moment didn't have to define their entire future. It was meaningful work that honored the opportunity Admiral Chun had given him and justified the faith that so many people had shown in his ability to change. More than that, it was work that transformed his own painful experience into a resource for helping others, proving that even serious mistakes could become the foundation for extraordinary service. As the California sun set over San Diego Bay, Davidson felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The angry, insecure young man who had assaulted a superior officer was still part of his story, but that person no longer defined his identity or limited his possibilities. Instead, he had become living proof that people could change in fundamental ways, that accountability and compassion could work together to create better outcomes than either could achieve alone, and that the United States Navy was stronger when it invested in developing its people rather than simply discarding them when they made mistakes. It was a legacy worth building, a mission worth dedicating his career to, and a daily reminder that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that happened not on distant battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of people who learned to become better versions of themselves.